He's called the most powerful man in the world and the most humble. But behind Xi Jinping's simple suits and soft-spoken persona lies a life few are allowed to see. Secret estates, billion-dollar trips, and surveillance systems built to erase questions before they're asked. This isn't just power, it's precision. And if you stay until the end, you'll discover the one thing he controls that even billionaires can't buy. The $20 million trip that no one was allowed to question. In July 2019, while state media aired footage of Xi Jinping smiling and shaking hands across African capitals, the real story was unfolding behind closed hotel wings and sealed diplomatic compounds. His official visit to Africa was framed as a gesture of global cooperation, but behind the cameras it functioned more like a billion-dollar CEO arriving to inspect overseas assets. And the bill? A staggering $20 million. Before his plane touched down, entire roadways were repaved. Local infrastructure was upgraded under emergency orders. 5-star hotels were shut down and retrofitted to match military-grade security specifications. At least 2 luxury suites were gutted and rebuilt using imported German steel, core blast doors, while entire floors were cleared for a rotating security team flown in ahead of schedule. According to confidential budget allocations, hotel modifications alone surpassed $3 million, funded through diplomatic cooperation grants. Dining arrangements received the same level of obsession. Every ingredient was flown in, certified organic, sourced from state-approved farms inside mainland China and pre-screened in laboratories for chemical contaminants. A mobile food lab disguised as a communications truck followed his motorcade. Meals were plated by a team of chefs trained at Blue Elephant Culinary Institutes, then passed through a protocol more stringent than that of Olympic anti-doping labs. One meal alone was rumored to cost over $5,000, factoring in transport, inspection, and emergency backup cuisine. But perhaps the most surreal aspect wasn't the cost, it was the scale. Xi didn't just travel, he moved like a state apparatus. 300 personnel, 60 vehicles, 2 decoy convoys, and a mobile medical team equipped with defibrillators, field surgery kits, and biometric scanners. Every public appearance was rehearsed the night before by body doubles, and even hotel staff was subjected to background checks conducted by embedded Chinese intelligence units. Official records listed the trip as strategic diplomacy, but for those who witnessed the layers of command, clearance, and construction, it felt like something else entirely. The movement of a sovereign institution disguised as a single man. Comment: diplomacy or domination if you think this wasn't a state visit. It was an empire on the move, and what happens when that empire stops pretending to travel light? Keep watching. The secret mansions paid with public money. Officially, Xi Jinping owns no personal real estate. No luxury high-rises in Shanghai, no ocean view villas in Sanya, no family estates passed down through generations. On paper, he is the embodiment of communist modesty, an image carefully maintained across every news broadcast and biography. But behind that image lies an architectural empire, funded not by private wealth, but by the state. Xi resides in Zhongnanhai, the walled compound west of the Forbidden City. Often described as China's equivalent of the White House, though the comparison doesn't come close. Zhongnanhai is not a house, it's a city. Private lakes, helipads, intelligence hubs, and underground passageways that stretch beneath Beijing's political core. But even that is only part of the map. Across China, a network of classified residential estates exists solely for top-level party members, and Xi's access reaches the apex. In the northern hills of Beijing, discreetly walled properties surrounded by military police units operate as unofficial presidential retreats. In Hangzhou, coastal villas facing the West Lake offer secluded hosting grounds for foreign dignitaries. Properties reinforced with biometric access systems and German-imported blast glass. In Guangzhou, newer constructions have been retrofitted with Faraday-caged interiors, shielding them from electronic surveillance and unauthorized drone mapping. None of these properties carry his name. They are state-owned, temporarily assigned to senior leaders. Yet the cost of maintaining these sites, security, renovation, staff, transportation, utilities, exceeds hundreds of millions of dollars annually, according to leaked provincial budgets. And since they are classified as government infrastructure, no audit trail leads to personal accountability. The opulence is subtle but unmistakable. Imported marble flooring from Carrara, Italian furnishings customized for pressure blast resistance, and seasonal landscaping flown in from private nurseries in Suzhou. These homes are not about appearance, they are about insulation, from media, from opposition, from consequence. And perhaps most telling is how these residences are used. Few photos exist, no press tours are allowed, no official blueprints are public. The very existence of these homes depends on silence, carefully maintained by a state apparatus that understands one thing well: luxury, when kept invisible, becomes even more powerful. Because in a system where wealth can't be declared, the most valuable asset is deniability. The dynasty they don't want you to see. In public, Xi Jinping presents himself as the son of a revolutionary, an heir to ideology, not inheritance. But beyond the official biographies and curated headlines, there's another legacy running in parallel, a dynasty of invisible assets, shielded by bureaucracy and built through generations of quiet accumulation. Xi does not appear on shareholder lists. His name doesn't surface in property deeds or offshore registries, but those close to him do. Over the years, multiple investigations, some leaked, some suppressed, have traced a constellation of holdings connected to his extended family. From state-leagued real estate groups to mining and energy firms with opaque ownership chains, the Xi network operates not through blatant ownership, but through proxies, shell entities, and circular cross-holdings. One Hong Kong-registered firm with links to Xi's relatives once controlled multi-million-dollar stakes in rare earth extraction zones in Jiangxi and Sichuan. Another group, tied to a cousin by marriage, held interests in overseas property deals valued above $1.2 billion, including assets in Vancouver, London, and Sydney. None of these holdings were illegal, but their structures were designed for discretion. Layered legal entities, silent partners, and offshore custodianships in places like the British Virgin Islands. Then there are the antiquities, quiet symbols of generational power. Sources inside China's private auction circuit have spoken of Qing dynasty jade pieces and Tang-era scrolls, some worth tens of millions, reportedly acquired through family foundations aligned with party-length art institutions. These relics don't sit in museums. They sit in temperature-controlled vaults inside fortified compounds, preserved, insured, and hidden. What makes this dynasty different isn't just its wealth, it's its protection. While Xi's anti-corruption campaign has toppled hundreds of generals, bankers, and executives, none of these family-linked ventures have been touched. Investigations vanish, journalists are redirected, public records disappear. The system, it seems, knows where not to look. And that's the final layer of insulation. Not just legal, but political. In a country where fortune can shift with a whisper, this dynasty isn't chasing headlines or Forbes lists. It exists off the grid, quiet, global, untouchable. A shadow empire whose currency isn't just cash, it's control. The billionaire president who pretends to be poor. The public sees a man in a windbreaker, standing with farmers in a rice field, sleeves rolled, chopsticks in hand. No Rolex, no entourage, no trace of opulence. State media calls it authenticity. But behind the modest jacket is a marketing machine engineered for one outcome: untouchability through humility. Xi Jinping's image is one of extreme restraint. He's filmed eating steamed buns at humble diners. His convoy avoids luxury logos. When he visits disaster zones, he walks, never rides. His speeches reference sacrifice, endurance, and serving the people. Every shot is tightly composed. Practical shoes, wrinkle-lined brow, no visible security. It's political cinema, crafted not for applause, but for loyalty. But the illusion cracks when you zoom out. In a country where mere jokes can trigger investigations, Winnie the Pooh has become contraband, not for ideology, but because someone once said she resembled the bear. The comparison went viral. The censorship that followed went further. Social platforms scrubbed posts, images vanished. Even a Hollywood film featuring the character was banned from release in mainland theaters. The message was clear: ridicule breaks the narrative. And in this narrative, Xi is not allowed to be mocked. Because he isn't just a leader, he is a curated symbol of national purity, a servant of the people, too clean to own a mansion, too noble to wear a designer watch. Never mind the fact that his suits are tailored by high-end state tailors in Beijing, with prices rivaling pieces from Hermenegildo Zegna, or that the hotels he stays in are gutted and rebuilt to his specifications, often costing millions per floor. His personal travel requires fleets of vehicles, mobile medical units and biometric security that would rival the setups used for heads of global corporations. Yet none of it is shown. What remains public is the bowl of noodles, the handshake, the unguarded smile. This is not poverty. It's the branding of austerity, the kind that can't be fact-checked because the facts never air. And in the vacuum that follows, what remains is perception. Xi, the frugal leader. Xi, the man of the people. Comment, modesty or myth? If you think what you're seeing is strategy, not simplicity. Because when power wears humility, it often hides wealth, even better than gold. The man who runs a country like a private company. He doesn't tweet, he doesn't make shareholder calls, but every decision passes through him, and nothing scales without his signature. Xi Jinping doesn't run a country in the traditional sense. He operates something far more precise, a vertically integrated empire, structured like a holding company, with himself as the chairman, CEO and board combined. Officially, he holds 3 titles: President of China, General Secretary of the Communist Party, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission. Each alone would be powerful. Together, they form an architecture of control unprecedented in modern Chinese history. Legislative power? Routed through the National People's Congress, where voting margins routinely exceed 98%. Judicial authority? Administered by courts whose loyalty is pledged to the party first, the Constitution second. Military command? Direct, personal, and absolute. There is no separation of powers, there is only the illusion of process, tightly choreographed beneath a single desk. At the center of this system is not a committee or a cabinet. It's a persona. Xi's image is reproduced across screens, books and classrooms. School children study Xi Jinping thought before they study algebra. State television runs documentaries on his visionary leadership during prime time, often set to orchestral swells and slow zooms. Corporate leaders don't lobby the government, they study it, mirror it and align their language with it to avoid being replaced. Even major tech companies, brands like Alibaba, Tencent and ByteDance, have been reshaped to fit the Xi model. CEOs are no longer just business executives, they are expected to behave like civil servants, submitting internal structures to party supervision. A misstep doesn't just mean a fine, it means disappearance, delisting or dissolution. Decisions happen faster in this environment. There's no opposition to negotiate with, no coalition to form. When a policy is drafted, it's deployed. When a leader is purged, they vanish. In this sense, China functions not as a bureaucracy, but as a centralized executive machine, where power is not delegated, it's leased, monitored and recalled at will. To outsiders, the system looks efficient. To insiders, it feels airtight. And at the top sits one man who never runs for re-election, never holds a press conference, and never loses a vote. Because in this model, governance isn't shared, it's owned. How Xi uses tech to stay untouchable. In the age of satellites and smartphones, the most powerful weapon isn't firepower, it's infrastructure. While Western leaders rely on media cycles and voter sentiment, Xi Jinping governs through something far more durable, an algorithmic empire coded into the architecture of daily life. It begins with visibility, or the illusion of it. Across China's urban centers, over 700 million surveillance cameras form the largest real-time monitoring system on Earth. Many of them are embedded with facial recognition algorithms developed by state-backed firms and sharpened through artificial intelligence engines. Brands like Hikvision and SenseTime power this network, capturing not just faces, but gait, body temperature, and micro-expressions. A single frown outside a courthouse can be time-stamped, flagged, and added to a behavioral index in seconds. Then comes the social credit system, a digitized scoring mechanism that tracks more than just finances. It ranks citizens on everything from online activity to punctuality and paying utility bills. Fall below a certain threshold and the penalties arrive quietly: slower internet, blocked travel bookings, and denied job applications. In 2022 alone, over 1.5 million citizens were reportedly banned from purchasing plane tickets, not by a judge, but by a server. For Xi, this isn't overreach. It's optimization. The same architecture that monitors dissent also manages public resources, dispatches emergency response units, and even predicts unrest before it erupts. The police no longer need to chase criminals in the streets. They're guided by heat maps, AI-predicted threat zones, and cloud-based risk modeling software. Inside government offices, decision-making is increasingly shaped by data dashboards, visual command centers that aggregate citizen sentiment, economic signals, and social behavior into real-time forecasts. Officials no longer read reports, they read analytics. And at the top of this machine sits a man whose greatest weapon is not his voice, but his silence. Xi doesn't need to speak often because the system speaks for him. In echoes, in code, in millions of daily permissions granted or revoked, with no explanation given. It's not a surveillance state, it's a behavioral operating system, and every citizen lives inside it, not with walls, with bandwidth. Not through fear, through friction. And in that invisible pressure, the power remains, not seen, but never absent. The Iowa story that Western media fell for. In 1985, a little-known agricultural official from northern China stepped off a plane in Des Moines, Iowa. He was there to learn about corn, soil rotation, American productivity. His itinerary was modest: farm visits, town hall meetings, polite dinners with local officials. The trip lasted just 2 weeks. But nearly 40 years later, that brief visit has been repackaged into a diplomatic myth. The man was Xi Jinping. And the narrative that followed wasn't accidental, it was architectural. Western media often recalls the Iowa story with warmth. A future superpower's leader, once humbled by American hospitality, now paying it forward through strategic partnerships. It's portrayed as proof that even the most powerful leaders are shaped by simple beginnings. But behind the nostalgia is something far more calculated. A foundational chapter in China's soft power playbook. Xi's return to Iowa in 2012 as vice president wasn't just a reunion, it was a press maneuver. He retraced his steps, shook the same hands, revisited the farmhouse where he once stayed. Journalists called it endearing. Analysts called it disarming. But for Xi, it was a carefully designed message. I remember where I came from, and I understand where you're coming from too. That perception proved useful. In the years following, while other Chinese officials struggled with Western media optics, Xi was seen as the Western-facing reformer. The man who once slept in a spare bedroom on a Midwestern farm now led the world's second-largest economy, and still talked about corn yields. That contrast created a buffer. It softened criticism. It humanized policy. But the real brilliance wasn't in what Xi said. It was in what he didn't. The Iowa narrative gave Western audiences a lens, and Xi gave them a reflection, one that felt familiar, safe, even hopeful. All while trade policies tightened, censorship expanded, and surveillance technology matured under his administration. Today, that same story is still referenced in diplomatic meetings, press briefings, and cultural exchanges. It's more than a memory, it's a myth with utility. A nostalgic thread that masks strategic rewiring. Because Xi didn't just visit Iowa to learn about farming, he came to study perception. And decades later, it's the one crop he continues to harvest with near-perfect precision. The empire he built that can't be voted out. Most leaders are elected, some are appointed. Xi Jinping was engineered, not just into power, but into permanence. While Western democracies rotate leadership like seasonal strategy shifts, Xi built something entirely different. A government without expiration, a throne without a crown, and a system that doesn't need votes to stay alive. It began with consolidation. First, he dissolved the consensus model that governed China for decades, where power was distributed across factions and leaders retired after 2 terms. Then, in 2018, the term limit for the presidency was quietly deleted, not extended, deleted. In its place stood a leadership blueprint with no off-ramp, no succession plan, no final chapter. Under Xi, the lines between party, state, and military were blurred, not by accident, but by design. The Communist Party of China, CPC, became the central nervous system. The State Council was restructured to implement party will, not balance it. And the People's Liberation Army didn't serve the country, it served the party, and by extension, its chairman. Every ministry, committee, and court was pulled closer to a single gravitational center. What was once a sprawling, multi-tiered bureaucracy now operated more like a vertical stack, streamlined, loyal, and immune to outside interference. Loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was required. Even internal criticism risked expulsion, silence, or sudden reassignment. Xi's image was fused with the system itself. His philosophies, branded as Xi Jinping thought, were codified into the constitution, taught in schools, and required reading for party members. It wasn't just ideology, it was branding, state-certified, media-amplified, globally distributed. And while foreign media often focuses on his public profile, the true architecture of power is quieter. He doesn't need to campaign, he doesn't need to debate, he doesn't even need to explain. The system around him absorbs critique and reflects only consensus. There are no televised oppositions, no vote counts, no election nights. This is not a presidency. It's a political operating system where power doesn't transition, it self-replicates. And at the center is a man who isn't just leading the country, he has become indistinguishable from its machinery. Comment, government or design, if you think Xi didn't just win power, he became the algorithm behind it. Because in this empire, votes don't change anything, but code does. From the hidden mansions paid with public money to the algorithmic empire that keeps dissent invisible, Xi Jinping's life is not just wealthy, it's engineered. No elections, no accountability, and no visible luxury. Just a perfectly constructed narrative of modesty built on a foundation of global influence and absolute control. If you want more untold stories from the highest circles of power, politics, and shadow empires, hit like, subscribe to Billionaire Story, and drop a comment with who you want us to uncover next. Because the wealth you don't see is often the one that rewrites the world.